So good afternoon. It's wonderful to welcome you all to this event via Zoom. It's one of the first that we have this semester. My name is Rosa Celorio, and I'm actually Associate Dean for International and Comparative Legal Studies at GW Law School. And today we're going to be discussing the effects and the impact of COVID-19 on the situation of Indigenous peoples. And I feel very honored and privileged to be joined by tremendous and very experienced speakers today to discuss these matters with you. We actually have, as part of our panel today, Monica Koch, who is actually a Quechua Maya practicing lawyer and expert from Belize in Central America. And her area of practice combines international human rights law with Indigenous peoples. Many of you may know Monica from her astoundingly amazing and tremendous work on behalf of the Maya communities and villages, in Belize, and particularly she was actually a member of the legal team that represented the Maya communities in the landmark case of the Maya Leaders Alliance versus Attorney General Belize that was litigated before Belize courts and also the Caribbean Court of Justice. She also obtained her JD degree from the United States from Indiana University Law School and practiced as a criminal defense attorney in North Carolina for a number of years. I also would like to welcome Professor Marjolaine Olwell. She's currently pursuing her SJD and also serving as a professor of practice for the University of Arizona Law School. And before that, she worked for a very long time for the Rapporteurship on Indigenous Peoples at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And she also has a very lengthy history working on behalf of Aboriginal peoples in Canada and litigating individual cases in Canada in this regard. And she actually represented survivors within the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement as well. And I also have the honor of presenting Professor Alessandra Santaki, who is really a leading authority on Indigenous peoples around the world. We all follow her research and scholarship very closely in the realm of Indigenous peoples. She's a professor of law at Brunel University, London in the United Kingdom, and also the research director of the Brunel Law School. And more importantly, she's a professor at an Oxford program, at our Oxford GW Law program. So we are all very familiar with her work and her collaboration with GW Law School as well. And I also would like to present Laura Calle, who is our brilliant LLM student who put together this event. This event is possible thanks to the efforts of Laura Calle. She's actually an Indigenous peoples expert herself, and she's actually completing her PhD in this area, plus she's one of our ongoing LLM students as well. So thank you, Laura, for all of your efforts in this event as well. I also want to thank our co-sponsors. We have the Student International Law Society, who's co-sponsoring this event, and also the Institut des Amériques. And thank you for your collaboration with the International and Comparative Law Program. So before I pose some questions to our panelists, I wanted to say just some brief introductory remarks to kind of place the issues in a little bit of context and why are we organizing an event on COVID-19 and Indigenous peoples. As most of you know, COVID-19 is a health pandemic of epic proportions and a widespread crisis around the world. At this stage, we have more than 31 million cases confirmed worldwide and more than 900,000 deaths. We're almost at the million mark. And one of the most important things that has happened with COVID-19 is that it has forced us to really change the way we live, and it has forced many states to adopt measures that have completely altered the way we conduct our daily lives, including orders of shelters in place, quarantines, curfews, the closing of schools, businesses and employment places, social distancing measures, the suspension of international flights, the closing of borders, and many other measures. And there is emerging data, although there are voids in that data, and that's something that we can talk a little bit about today. There is emerging data illustrating that Indigenous peoples are among the groups that are disproportionately impacted and affected by COVID-19 in terms of not only the spread of COVID-19, but also the high mortality rates. And there have been a number of groups that have been identified as disproportionately affected, and Indigenous peoples is one of those groups. And there's a number of concerns that we have, especially thinking about the issue from a human rights lens and from an international law lens. Indigenous people worldwide are still fighting daily to see their rights to self-determination, consultation, their territories and natural resources, non-discrimination, and effective participation to be fully respected. They also face inequalities and obstacles in access to basic economic, social, and cultural rights, such as access to healthcare, water, food security, and formal employment. COVID-19 doesn't necessarily create these problems, it aggravates them in many ways. It accentuates problems that are already there. It worsens many of the barriers and challenges that Indigenous peoples were already facing to see their rights respected, protected, and fulfilled. There's also concerns about specific risks that specific members within Indigenous peoples groups are facing, like, for example, women and people's involuntary isolation. And I think this leads us to an important reflection point of what are the roles of international law, of human rights law standards, of Indigenous self-governance structures, of Indigenous communities, in responses and strategies to counter and mitigate the effects of COVID-19 on Indigenous peoples. Our panelists will be discussing a lot of these issues today. Before I actually move on to the first question, I just want to make sure that all of you have your microphones on mute. We want to make sure that we preserve the bandwidth while we're having this wonderful discussion. And at the end of the discussion, we will have a space to ask your questions, and feel free to actually include your questions in the chat function in Zoom. So I want to start with a question to Monica Cook, who's joining us today from Belize. Monica, I wanted to ask you, and this is on the basis of all this experience that you have working with the Maya in Belize and as a legal advisor, etc. From all of that experience with Indigenous communities, what would you say are the main threats faced by Indigenous people since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic? And thank you for being here again. You have to unmute.
Sorry.
Yeah, there. Thank you.
Rosa, thank you very much for inviting me. I am very excited about this discussion today. I hope to learn a lot from yourself and the other speakers that are here today. I am humbled, and again, thank you. So in response to your question, main threats that are faced by Indigenous peoples since the beginning of COVID, like you rightly said, that some of these issues aren't caused by the pandemic itself, but are exacerbated by it. One of the three of the main areas that I see as threats are initially, at least in Southern Belize, was one of food security. The second being access to, say, the economy. It had a very hard impact on local economies, and also in respect to education and access to education for our children. But initially, in the beginning, what had happened when Belize first got their first cases, I think in March, towards the end of March 2020. And so in response to that, the government decided that they needed to institute a state of emergency, where they also ordered a complete shutdown of the country. That is, you could only leave your house for essential reasons, say seeking medical care or going to get food. And this happened in the height of the dry season, which is, if you're familiar with Toledo, dry season is when most Indigenous communities prepare their plots or their milpas for the planting season. And so one of the things that the government also instituted was a statutory instrument that banned burning of all any kind of vegetation debris, and that included agricultural fields and milpa. And so that was a very scary time for our communities, because if not only did it ban it, they also said that if you were to burn, you'll be criminalized. That is, you could face up to $5,000 in fines or imprisonment up to 2 years. And so here we are, our leaders saying, well, our hands are tied. We can't burn, we can't prepare our plots for planting, and we can't go out. We don't have jobs. So what are we gonna do now? And so one of the things that as a member of the legal team for the local leaders down here, I had advised that we write the minister that's responsible for this SI and ask them to make an exception to milpa burning, because it really affected our food security, our ability to provide for ourselves and to produce food for our communities. And thankfully, I feel like we do a lot of letter writing to the government here. Thankfully, they responded favorably, and they took our issues into consideration, and they made an exception. Because one of the things that I noted in that SI was that they made an exception for big agriculture, but not for the small farmers, not for Indigenous peoples. And so that was one of the things that we pointed out. If you can do it for them, you can do it for the little people. And thankfully, they listened, and most farmers were able to prepare their plots for the planting season. And so that was in the beginning. Now another issue that I've noticed is that normally, while a lot of the Indigenous peoples down here are subsistence farmers, any excess that they might have, they would trade it either in the international market or the local markets. But because we had a complete lockdown, a lot of them weren't able to sell their produce. So even after the lockdown was no longer there, what happened was the borders are still closed. So a lot of our border communities aren't able to, say, trade with, say, Guatemala, for instance. And so what that does is that it has really impacted the cash economies in these villages. And so that's how I see those are two of the main threats. So it would be the and also the cash economy, not being able to sell your produce. And so the third thing that I see as a threat is that while many schools have gone online, and children are able to access, online schooling, online resources, the same can't be said for Indigenous communities. Particularly in Southern Belize, most of our communities don't even have electricity, much less internet access. And so now that schools have officially opened, which we say online online schooling opened September 7th, initially what the government did is they would print curriculums and work from the schools in newspapers for the rural children. But I don't think it worked, because that would mean you would have to come into town to access those newspapers to take it back to your villages. And with transportation down, and there was a complete lockdown, it was a mess. It was not organized properly. And to date, since schools have been opened, they've been sending printed material home to those students. But there's another layer of complication there in respect of the literacy rates within those communities, and the parents' ability to impart you know, whatever it is that's being sent home to their children. And so, I mean, so there's, you know, layer upon layer of challenges and difficulties that have been, like I said, not caused by COVID-19, but exacerbated by it. And so, as I see it, these are probably the three main areas that are being faced by Indigenous peoples, but definitely the issues of job secure, job losses, and the economy has had a hard impact. Fortunately for most of these communities, them being subsistence farmers, I think there's a resilience factor there that, that we will discuss a little bit later in relation to that. But I guess in a nutshell, those are the three areas that I see. And of course, there are others, but I know I'm limited to time.
Thank you, Monica, so much for presenting a view of the challenges, you know, that many Indigenous communities are facing at this particular moment, especially aggravated by COVID-19. Connected to that, Professor Santaki, I wanted to ask you, when you hear about challenges like the ones that were just narrated by Monica, how do you see the connection between international human rights law and those challenges? And do you think that international human rights law can be useful in adopting or identifying strategies to address COVID-19 and its impact on Indigenous communities and peoples?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's fantastic to be in this in this meeting alongside other brilliant speakers, but also, as you know, I have this special affinity towards George Washington Law School. Okay, so what you asked me, indeed, I am one of the optimistic international lawyers. I think that international human rights law has a lot to tell us, and it's a tool that helps us through all human rights violations, and this includes the violations that come together with another crisis, COVID. So there are two systems that I'm going to focus on, and maybe other speakers are going to focus on others. First of all, the universal international system. We have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that has been adopted in 2007 and has very clear ideas about how to help. And we also have the general human rights system, so the general documents, especially the documents that focus on socioeconomic rights, so and such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but also the documents that focus on minimizing poverty, especially the UN guiding principles on extreme poverty and human rights, and the Sustainable Development Goals. So all these documents, if we put them together, have specific tools, human rights tools, that will help us find avenues and ways forward. So the one category is socioeconomic rights. So exactly what Monica was saying earlier, governments have the obligation, and it is a legal obligation to ensure that all inhabitants have the minimum socioeconomic rights, and so they have the responsibility to focus on the right to health, access to medication, to minimize extreme poverty, and the right to food that Monica was talking about. So this would be together with everybody else, because sometimes, you know, people say, why would Indigenous peoples or other or minorities have different rights to our rights? So we all have the same rights. So governments have to ensure that Indigenous populations have exactly the same rights. But because of their vulnerability and because of their specific characteristics, Indigenous peoples have some additional obstacles that they have to fight when it comes to COVID-19. So the fact that they are they have remote access, some of them. The fact that they are 3 times more likely to suffer from extreme poverty, the fact that they're prone to infections, the fact, an excellent point that Monica did, the fact that a lot of them have no internet and they don't have the technology. So governments, in order to ensure that there is no discrimination, will have to take additional measures. And I think this is something that we all states have to understand, and there need to be additional measures for Indigenous people to ensure that they are that their specific special needs are identified, they are protected, and they are prioritized. And in order to do this, I think that what they need to do is they need to give a fantastic tool that maybe I'll talk about it a bit later, is they need to ensure FPIC, so free, prior and informed consent. So Indigenous peoples, one of the main avenues that we have not seen it being very operational so far, is that all measures on Indigenous peoples have to be led by Indigenous groups. So we see a lot of, not a lot, but we see several governments that take measures for Indigenous peoples, but at least in my research, I have only identified less than a handful of states who have asked Indigenous themselves how they can protect them. And I think this is one of the main tools, in addition to self-determination, that maybe Professor Olwell will talk about.
Thank you, Professor Santaki. And I think it connects very well to the question that I have next for Professor Olwell. I wanted to ask you, Professor Olwell, particularly about that connection between the national and international law level. I mean, you have an amazing career working with Indigenous peoples. And one of the reasons why it's an amazing career is because you're being able to see this at the national, but also at the international level. You know, and there's different national regimes, there's plurality of legal systems. So I wanted to ask you your thoughts on what's happening at the national level right now, especially with the legal perspective. And do you think that we have sufficient national laws or strategies to really address the situation of Indigenous people at the moment with COVID-19?
Thank you, Rosa, for your question. So essentially, well, and also thank you for having me here. I don't want to be redundant, but it's just really exciting to be able to partaking in this conversation with amazing minds, and with all the students that are coming back, you know, at the beginning of a new semester and a kind of new era. So I sort of wanted to point that out. So regarding your question, I guess my take would be that I believe that contemporary national laws are not doing enough to protect Indigenous peoples during the crisis. And I am going to focus both on the laws that were there prior to the pandemic hitting, right, that had allowed vast disparities in terms of rights for Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous communities. And then the ones that were set in place. And now a lot of the things I'm going to say will sort of touch on what was mentioned before. So I apologize for the redundance, but they're all sort of very much interrelated, right? So I think my stance would be, or my sort of the main takeaway would be, I feel COVID has highlighted the weaknesses of state legislation and state policymaking with regards to Indigenous peoples in general, right? It brought to light the fact that there was health disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, the lack of housing infrastructure, lack of access to water and sanitation and soap and other sort of alcohol, for disinfectants, unequal access to broadband internet, chronic underfunding of Indigenous-led health and other kind of infrastructures. And also, and that's sort of what I'm going to close with, the lack of support to Indigenous people's autonomous decisions to close off their communities and territories, or to enact their own sort of solutions to the COVID-19 crisis. So if you think about it, and just going a bit more into detail with all of what I've just sort of highlighted, there's issues with substandard and overcrowded housing in Indigenous communities, right? And that has made compliance with quarantine and social distancing measures or guidelines entirely unfeasible, right? there's lack of access to water and sanitation. And so the guidelines on hygiene and frequent hand washing and those requirements were impossible to set in place in a lot of communities, right? And I'm not just speaking about remote communities in the Amazon. In the United States, the Navajo Nation doesn't even have access in some remote areas to safe drinking water, right? And to flowing water. And so in the case of a pandemic, these issues are wildly exacerbated. You know, as Monica was mentioning earlier, you know, a lot of sort of issues and health disparities are going to be compounded by the lack of internet and sort of broadband internet or telecommunications connectivity. And so how do you have access to what the guidelines are to stop the spread of coronavirus if you don't have access to the means by which usually the information is disseminated, right? And so it's also rendered children and adolescents unable to continue their education, right, further burdening parents. And so all of these factors are contributing to the vast contagion and the grave impact of coronavirus on Indigenous communities, right? They've led to these communities being harder hit, but also to an increased lethality in these communities, right? So there's not just further contagion, there's also, or contamination, there's also higher numbers and deaths in Indigenous communities, and that's a product or a byproduct of the lack of investment of states and the lack of effective national policies towards to guarantee sort of social, economic, and cultural rights of Indigenous peoples in the first place. And now, as Professor Santaki or Alexandra was mentioning, let's all be on a first name basis, right? This is a conversation. And so unfortunately, new legislation also came up or did the same thing, right? Indigenous peoples were largely sort of left out of the COVID response. From the very onset of the crisis, they were forgotten from the policies that were being devised to address the pandemic. So we know that there was a very low level of preparedness. States did not expect a pandemic, although we could discuss as to whether they should have, but that's another conversation. And they were unprepared for it, and they had to sort of run for it and figure it out. But when they did not in any opportunity, except for very few states, and a lot of them at much later steps along the way, decide to actually include Indigenous peoples in any form of national pandemic contingency plans. So nationwide measures to stop the pandemic were applied to Indigenous territories without their free, prior, and informed consent. They never took into consideration their lived realities or the fact that, for instance, they lived in remote regions, their cultural differences, right? You know, and that often led to the measures that were set in place to sort of lead to ridiculous results, right? Indigenous people living in remote communities, if they wanted to have access to some financial compensation and help, would have to leave their remote communities, take public transportation all the way to the city, which was infected, to go in a line with hundreds of other people to request the bono de seguridad and like obtain some financial compensation, essentially exposing themselves to risk to be capable of having access to financial aid that would supposedly protect them from the risk, right? There was a lot of absurd results precisely because, as was mentioned earlier, these measures or Indigenous communities have specific realities, specific vulnerabilities, and those need to be thought of and considered while devising national contingency plans, right? And that didn't actually happen. So, you know, other cases were, for instance, the COVID-19 prevention guidelines were not always translated into Indigenous communities. They weren't culturally relevant in both content or the form of presentation. They were often disseminated through means like television, online, or other sort of formats that were inaccessible to many Indigenous communities, right? And so I'm trying to think, I think another issue is that often when Indigenous communities were not involved in the decision making, but at least were considered in the plans, they were also often amalgamated within this sort of broader group of vulnerable groups, and the responses continued to fail or to adequately take into account their realities, right, and their specific needs, given their specific lifestyle. So this sort of leads me to my final point. I don't want to give a too long answer, but I believe the essential element for an efficient state response to the pandemic for Indigenous peoples is the respect of the autonomy of Indigenous peoples to manage the situation locally, while providing them with the information and the financial and material support they identify as necessary. Who better than themselves will know how to inform the community, how to protect themselves, how to integrate their own cultural practices and medicines and alternative medicines in the appropriate response. So it's not letting them to themselves to figure it out. That is not what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of resilience, strength, knowledge, culture within Indigenous communities, and a lot of them have actually brought these up and devised some very functional plans. And so governments in their national approach should support these measures and support Indigenous communities that have themselves judged appropriate, that have judged some measures sort of appropriate in a sort of the application of their collective right to autonomy and self-government, right? And to tie this in with what was said earlier, these are rights that are guaranteed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we're now only talking about actually implementing them appropriately, not just theoretically, but in practice, in anything a state does, in any plan that an Indigenous, that a state decides to implement with regards to Indigenous communities. And just a final sentence, I know I like to talk a lot, so it's really final point, I would just say that the measures that have up until now, or what has worked up until now in many Indigenous communities across the world, right? So in the Americas, I've noticed it in my work, but also if you look at the recent report of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, his specific report on COVID really had an analysis of the realities of Indigenous communities all over the world. And what seems to have worked has been self-isolation to sort of prevent the transmission of the virus. And these self-isolation measures were imposed by the communities themselves. And they weren't always sort of all or nothing at all sort of proposition. They've found a lot of very creative ways to guarantee, for instance, a market that would be set in place right outside the community so as to not contact them, but not in the local, not in the nearest village, right? So they wouldn't be in contact, and with all these different measures to guarantee sort of security and biosecurity measures, right? So I guess my point is merely that there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of creativity, and states should sort of focus on that and respect those in the spirit of the UNDRIP. So, okay, end of my first answer.
Thank you, Marjolaine. That was wonderful. And I want to connect actually the point that you just made about autonomy and the importance, you know, of like self-governance structures and the responses that Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples are employing. And I want to ask Monica if you could share a little bit about your experience with strategies, you know, that communities and the villages are undertaking to address COVID-19. And I also wanted to ask you a little bit about the environment. You know, how is this connected to biodiversity and the environment and concerns for the environment in general as well?
Thank you, Rosa. Yes, I am very glad that Marjolaine touched on some of the issues that are, you know, very real on the ground here in Southern Belize. Initially, when we first heard of this COVID-19 pandemic, it did take, you know, it took us by surprise. And I'm sure we're not unique in that respect. But it was amazing for me to see the reactions and the decisions taken by traditional leaders, which we refer to as alcaldes down here, in response to this pandemic. It was amazing to see how they worked. Down here, our alcaldes have formed an association, which we call the Toledo Alcaldes Association. And so they're, you know, where all 39 communities have their alcaldes that are members of this association, and they work very closely with, say, the My Leaders Alliance. And so what that allowed them to do was to be able to access information and to get information to the communities that don't have access to, like you were saying, a lot of these guidelines, these health and safety guidelines, were being generated through the internet, and or through other medium that most IP communities would not have access to. And so it was amazing for me to see how quickly they were able to organize and started disseminating information to these communities. In fact, in one community, I noticed, because of the social distancing requirements related to COVID-19, what normally would happen is the alcalde has a group of village policemen who would normally go house to house and deliver message from the alcalde about, say, community meetings or important things going on in the community. Now, because of social distancing requirements, they could no longer do that. So they had to get very creative in how they were going to disseminate information to the community. And in one community in particular, what they did was they rented a loudspeaker and mounted it on a truck, and would drive it around the community, and would give information related to safety guidelines, and would give information related to the statutory instruments that the government were enacting in relation to, for instance, curfews or the mandatory wearing of masks, etc. And so this is one way that they were dealing. And if you understand the way that we live in our indigenous communities, everything is sometimes too communal, in that even just our home setting, everything that we do. For instance, one of the things that we practice down here is the fajina system, which is the communal cleaning of public areas in the village. Some of those things had to be suspended, or we had to become creative in terms of how we were going to continue to take care of our spaces in light of COVID-19. And so the idea that in another community, for instance, one of the things that they did was they instituted a checkpoint. And so that initially helped with the spread of COVID. What they did was they would only allow necessary traffic into the community. That is, if you were going to deliver food, medicines, etc., and you could only come out of that community if you were going, same thing, seeking medical attention or trying to, groceries, things of that nature. And so what that did was it really curbed the spread of the disease. And for a very long time, we did not have any positive cases in southern Belize. But recently that has changed with the lockdown being lifted, and I think a lot of people kind of put their guards down. So right now, unfortunately, we do have about 12 cases in southern Belize. What I know in my community, in the community that I come from, there is one positive case, and then what the leadership has done is that they've asked that family to isolate from the rest of the community so as to stop the spread. So we're gonna, that's the decision that they took. Hopefully we'll see whether that will work. The other thing, the other concern that I personally have in relation to that, I just saw a new statutory instrument that was issued, I believe, yesterday by the state, in that they're now requiring the Minister of Health to give the names of positive persons who test positive to the Minister of National Security, which is of great concern to us because of the privacy issues there. So I don't know what the reasoning is behind that, other than maybe for people who are not isolating or not obeying the quarantine rules, maybe. But I think that is just, it's still, we need to be able to balance the privacy issues against public health issues. And as these statutory instruments keep coming out one after the next, it's sometimes hard to keep track of them. And like Marjolin mentioned, it's amazing to me to see that, you know, they say ignorance of the law is no defense. But the thing is, in some of these communities, if you're not aware of these statutory instruments, how can you be held accountable? I mean, one of the things that I've noticed here, I still do practice some criminal law in Southern Belize. And so the other day I was sitting in court, and I've noticed a huge number of Maya, of Indigenous women, being brought into court because they breached some statutory instrument requiring, say for instance, wearing masks, or not social distancing, or curfews. And it was amazing to me to see the number of grandmothers that are being hauled into court as a result of that. And I do believe that a lot of them, because they're coming from areas, they may not know, they may not be aware of some of these measures, because it changes so often. Like even for me, who keep up with these things like curfews, there are times that they change them, they're changed constantly. So just to be safe, what I do is, okay, my curfew is at 8 o'clock, and but there are lots of people that might not know that, and so that again is the lack of access to information. And these things, the government is spitting these things out quite quickly, where people might not have access to them, to be able to know how to behave, how to behave themselves. And so that to me, in relation to some of the other decisions that traditional leaders have, like I said, had to become creative in how they deal with these things. For instance, we have our border communities. The border between Guatemala and Belize is now closed. But we've been having, Belize was really good in the beginning, where we only had 18 cases, and after the lockdown, we were able to flatten that curve in terms of the infection rates. But once the measures were relaxed, what we started having were border jumpers. And so we had an issue with our border communities, with our alcaldes, trying to curb these border jumpers and these issues, but didn't have the support of the state, the larger national government. And so they did the best that they could. But, the system works wherever the traditional systems of governance work only when you have people respecting it. The people that live there, they respect it, they respect the authority of the alcaldes. But when we're talking about outsiders that aren't familiar with these systems, they have no respect or regard for the authorities or the systems that are in place. And so that is why these alcaldes would look to the national government for assistance. And so now what we have is an increase in COVID cases. And so it remains to be seen how this is going to impact our communities, because we have right now about four of our communities that have positive cases, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that with the measures that are in place, that we could curb them and that there won't be a spread. So we're still hopeful, and I think that people pretty much have been very and I have to say this, at least in Southern Belize, or maybe all of Belize, I have to say that people have been very respectful in terms of the guidelines. Like I've read about other places where some people don't believe it. It's a hoax. It's it's conspiracy. Here, I think that people are trying, and it shows in terms of the number of cases that we have. And the government has been really good in trying to educate the public, despite the challenges that we see in IP communities. In relation to the biodiversity, land tenure security, absolutely, I think that the recognition of Indigenous sovereignty, the preservation of those traditional livelihoods and the protection of lands and biodiversity is extremely important in helping to enhance Indigenous resilience to COVID-19. I say that because communities that have land tenure security also have food security, because they have the ability to grow and produce their own foods. They're able to hunt and gather and as well as collect medicinal plants for, you know, for their health. That not having this, I've noticed in communities that don't have that, that don't have that luxury of land tenure security, that they're suffering the most right now. I've noticed communities, say in the city, where they're, you know, the housing is an issue or land is an issue. And so, yes, when we look at Indigenous communities and we see communities that are often cash poor, but are also rich in their abilities, not only to grow their own food, but rich in the knowledge of what, say, the forest that the forest has to offer them. And so I think that this will definitely help them in terms of surviving this pandemic. As you all know, that land is intricately tied into the livelihood and the spiritual well-being of Indigenous communities. And that's why in Southern Belize, I often say to you know, members of our community that you got to be grateful for the recognition of your land rights, because other communities don't have that same luxury. There are other communities that are still fighting for recognition of that, for recognition of your sovereignty and your land, and you know, your ability to make decisions on your own, and you have to own it, believe it. And so that's why I always think land security is very, very, very important for the continued livelihoods of our Indigenous communities, because without it, you know, we don't have anything. I mean, so I am very hopeful that despite the challenges that this pandemic has brought upon us in terms of our economy, in terms of access to education, in terms of access to healthcare, that with our Indigenous sovereignty and our traditional lands and the protection thereof, that we will not only survive, but that we will thrive, and that we will find meaningful ways of coping with this pandemic. And I think that answers that portion of your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, for sharing all of that with us. And we're trying to stay hopeful. It's difficult, right? It's very difficult to stay hopeful, but we're trying to do our best to stay hopeful in this context. You mentioned women in your, you know, and your remarks. You mentioned grandmothers, you know, and in a way that's a good segue for a question that I have for Marjolaine. Marjolaine, what is the situation of Indigenous women at the moment vis-a-vis COVID-19? I mean, they have been identified as a group of risk, and we know, of course, that they have suffered historical discrimination and violence against women all over, not just Indigenous women. So it would be great to hear your take on Indigenous women, and another group that has been constantly mentioned as well is people's involuntary isolation as well. So if you could give us your thoughts on those two groups, that would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rosa. And thank you, Monica, for that really powerful presentation. And it's really a great way for me to segue into what I meant to say on Indigenous women, because I think you really brought up a lot of the major issues there. So we all know that sort of because of their multidimensional identity, right, being both Indigenous, being women, right, Indigenous women are often exposed to sort of intersecting forms of discrimination and of violence, right? They're all related to their cultural identity, sex, gender, among other factors, right? And these occur both inside and outside of their communities, and can be the result of sort of also of historical and structural remnants of colonialism, right? And all the superpositions or the intersection of all these sort of layers of discrimination usually creates mutually reinforcing human rights violations. I think those are words of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And so these sources of discrimination and violence against Indigenous women have now been magnified by the pandemic, right? We all know that discrimination against women has been magnified, and discrimination against Indigenous peoples have been magnified, and Indigenous women find themselves at the crossroad, and these are mutually reinforcing. And so there's different examples that can be given that sort of highlight and showcase this, right? A lot of sort of studies have begun coming out right now showing a direct correlation between the confinement measures and a rise in domestic and other forms of violence against Indigenous women and children specifically, both in urban environments and inside communities, right? Measures like curfews or quarantines or lockdowns or travel restrictions have meant, that have been imposed for good reasons, right, to limit the outbreaks, have, however, also had the sort of rebound effect of creating restrictions for survivors of abuse from getting help, from reaching shelters. Some shelters had simply been closed down. Some of them saw all of their funding cut to be reoriented elsewhere, right? And from distancing themselves from their abusers. And so if you look at geographic isolation, limited and often, I mentioned earlier, sort of overcrowded housing, what I just mentioned, lack of open, properly financed shelters, and then sometimes limited law enforcement because they were now, trying to enforce social distancing instead of other measures. All of that has sort of been compounded during the pandemic. And in addition to this already extremely severe increase in violence against Indigenous women are also being affected financially, right? And violence against women is sort of correlated with economic insecurity, as we know, right? Rates of maternal mortality have reportedly been rising, and often have sort of resulted of a deprioritization of non-COVID related treatments, or the requirement for somebody to enter a hospital to have a negative test of COVID, for instance, right? There's also been increased risk because a lot of Indigenous women are employed in the informal sector, right? So there's been, and Monica just gave us really good examples, but there's been police violence against women seeking to sell items in the street or gathering wild produce in the forest, for instance, right? Or not properly social distancing because maybe they weren't aware of the specific curfew that day or the specific requirement as these were changing consistently. Indigenous people selling artwork or earning income through sort of cultural performances, right, were particularly affected by the halt to tourism. Domestic workers have been affected when their employers feared virus transmission and required them at times to stay in the household and not go back to their homes or communities, right? Separating them from their families, or vice versa, to go back in their communities and not come back in their place of work. And then in urban contexts, Indigenous workers often rely largely on informal and sort of labor markets, right? And so construction, domestic and other daily workers, and all of those were really hard hit by job losses, right? And another preoccupying issue is street vendors that have been banned from the streets, right? Or homeless people that have been banned from being outside or as a result of lockdowns and curfews. Where do they go, right? Another thing that has been reported with regards to women in general, but clearly affect in particular Indigenous women, is sort of the increase in workload of women in the household, right? So in addition to carrying out their usual tasks, which in Indigenous communities sometimes will be, cooking, getting firewood, and a lot of sort of labor-intensive, physically labor-intensive work, they often have to be the ones that are responsible for sort of ensuring that the preventative hygienic measures are being taken inside the home. It increases their need for safe water that needs to be collected, which requires them to go longer distances to get it. And they're often the ones that are burdened, or not burdened, but put in charge of taking care of the sick and of the children, right? So further exposing them. And then shifts from education to remote schooling at times, or just closing of schools has increased the workload of women once again, right? Deepening once again the sort of digital divide that I mentioned earlier between Indigenous and non-Indigenous segments of society, both for questions of access to broadband internet, or the costs of internet, and then sometimes just, issues with, non-existent sort of network reliability or speeds or whatnot. And so these are sort of realities that have immensely affected Indigenous women because of the coronavirus, right? Other communities or other sort of groups, it wasn't specific to your question, but I think it's really important just to briefly highlight, is elders, right? You did mention Indigenous grandmothers, and elders in Indigenous communities are pillars, right? They are a priority for Indigenous communities. They're keepers of history, of traditions, of culture, right? And the loss of an elder is the loss of culture, it's the loss of knowledge, it's the loss of language, and has a much broader impact inside a community than just the loss of one life, right? It's the impact is major. And so given that elders are now more at risk, and the rates of lethality amongst elders are high in some communities that haven't been capable of stopping the spread, that has also been extremely frightening and devastating for Indigenous communities. And then your question was also related to Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact. I don't know how many of the students that are listening today actually know what an Indigenous community in voluntary isolation and initial contact is. Maybe I'll just give sort of a brief description, unless Rosa, you tell me, no, I've taught it, they all know it. But I know, but I know in the United States, it's not something that people are generally aware of. So essentially, they're the, let's say, last peoples who are not colonized and who do not have permanent relations with today's predominant national societies, right? They still live generally in the Amazon region and live off the land in a very, very traditional way, and do not have much contact with sort of Western society, let's say, right? You might have seen pictures. Cultural Survival, for instance, as an NGO, works a lot with them and has been capable of having pictures of some communities still living in huts, for instance. And so those are the peoples we include inside people in voluntary isolation and initial contact. But those are two sort of subgroups. The first one is those in voluntary isolation. So it's Indigenous peoples who are do not sort of maintain sustained contacts with the majority non-Indigenous population, and who generally will reject any type of contact. And some of you might have seen this in the news, right? There was not so long ago a young missionary who decided to go try to convert Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact, and was shot and died, right, from an arrow, poisoned arrow, right? So this is exactly the type of people. It could be they've decided that they've seen enough of the outside world and they do not want to partake in it. It can be that they've never actually seen it, although that is becoming more and more unusual and unlikely. And it can be communities that had sort of intermittent contact, right? They can come out for food when there was a situation of drought or lack of food, or health issues. They'd come out for help, have some contact, and then when it was possible, they would return back to their communities and continue their lifestyles as is. But eventually decided they didn't want to have these types of contacts anymore, often because contact with people outside with non-Indigenous communities outside usually comes with a lot of bacteria and that their immune systems are not used to, and usually leads to sort of widespread pandemics inside the community, right? Killing major amounts of members of the society. And so voluntary isolation is that. There might have been some contact, but they've decided to no longer have any contact. Initial contact are those that do sort of have intermittent contact, come out sometimes for access to some services. And so what's really important to know is that Indigenous peoples that are living in voluntary isolation and initial contact are holders of human rights, and they're in a unique situation of vulnerability. And particularly because they are among the few who cannot actually advocate for themselves. They don't live in our way of life. They don't understand the way we live. They don't have the same understanding of the law and property rights, right? And so this reality sort of makes the ensuring the respect for the rights particularly important. And at the international level, what has been promoted was, as sort of one of the fundamental premises of international law with regards to these groups, was the necessity to understand this principle of no contact as the expression of the rights of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation, the expression of their right to self-determination. They are entitled to decide that they do not want to have contact, and in that case, there shouldn't be. Now, what happens is that there's a lot of legal loggers or miners that will enter their lands or areas, and this has been increased during COVID, right? There was less sort of state organized measures to address or to sort of repel or stop invasions by third parties, by non-Indigenous parties within these communities, and that has led to numerous deaths of members of these communities. I was in a panel just recently with Indigenous communities or representative of these Indigenous communities in Brazil, and they were essentially calling this is a cultural genocide. The communities are disappearing. They're dying at rates that are extremely problematic. They're already very small communities with very low sort of means for protection. And so it is a cause for really great concern. I don't want to be too negative, but, and because I'm ending on this, but it's true that the COVID has meant significant impacts and particularly preoccupying impacts on these communities. There you go.
Thank you very much, Marjolaine. And we're about to finish this discussion actually with a question for Alexandra. And I wanted to ask you about that connection between the national governments and Indigenous self-governance structures. You know, what connection do you think there should be, and what kind of collaboration there should be in light of the reality that we have with COVID-19?
Sorry, yes. I'm going to try to keep it short so that we can have some questions. I think that the main issue that I have identified is how things and how this crisis showed actually the problem with Indigenous rights and with the relationship between Indigenous communities and states. So states have been very eager to, if they do respect their Indigenous communities, to take measures to protect them. But Indigenous communities have not been seen as important partners in the COVID, in dealing with the COVID pandemic. And this is such a pity, and this says a lot about international human rights law and the non-Indigenous world. So though we say, and the whole human rights system was created to reinforce and implement this partnership between states and Indigenous groups, we have not taken advantage of the amazing lessons we can take from the Indigenous communities. So first of all, some states don't show any interest in specifically addressing the Indigenous concerns. and the particularities in COVID. Then we have the states that show some interest and they take special measures, excellent, but without indigenous participation. Then we have the third category of states who believe they are amazing, in indigenous issues, Australia and New Zealand, that actually have included indigenous peoples in the discussion on the measures of indigenous peoples. But then there is the actual partnership that should exist, that states should learn the lessons that the indigenous world has. So, all the lessons and all the knowledge, the traditional knowledge that indigenous peoples have on soaps, on antiseptics, on herbal ways to deal with the crisis. All the practices that they have. So for example, just to give you an example, in shielding, experiences and expertise and good practice. So for example, in Thailand, the Karen people, they have had for a long time this practice of shielding. We haven't learned, that non-indigenous world have not asked them to share with us so that we can learn these experiences. So I think that this is the actual point of the whole Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the whole conundrum on indigenous rights, that there is this partnership on equal levels between states and indigenous groups, and mutual support, but also mutual exchange of knowledge and information. And we have seen in this crisis that this doesn't work, it hasn't worked. And it's a pity, not only for indigenous communities, it is a real pity for the non-indigenous communities and the non-indigenous world, because we don't learn from these amazing practices and expertise and knowledge that we have next to us.
Alexandra, I couldn't think of a better way of ending this part of the event with those remarks and basically underscoring the value, of indigenous knowledge and practices. We have a lot to learn at the end of the day. I want to open it for questions and answers, and Laura Calle, our LLM student, will provide some commentary to open that section. And if you have any questions, please write them down with the function, and I leave the floor for Laura to give us some reactions and commentary.
Our speakers, Professor Santaki, Professor Aldwell, as well as our moderator, Dean Silorio, for making this event the great opportunity to open spaces like this, to have this kind of conversation. We have been, to be honest, very pleased and from experience and expertise. And I also want to thank all the participants. I would like to discuss 4 elements, but then I also want to leave some time for the participants to ask some questions. But I think the 4 elements that I thought were particularly meaningful throughout the discussion were, first, the fact that all speakers seem to share the same observation, that they did not create inequality and marginalization of indigenous peoples, because this is related to long-term historical structural condition. The pandemic has actually exacerbated the vulnerabilities of indigenous communities throughout the world. And Professor Aldwell mentioned the specific vulnerability of indigenous women, of indigenous peoples living in voluntary isolation, which is particularly concerning. I think a second element is that our speakers have also analyzed the effects of the pandemic on indigenous people through the lens of international human rights law. Professor Xanteki noted that international human rights standards and tools, whether they are universal or specific, are crucial to protect indigenous communities in times of COVID-19. However, we can see that both at the international or at the national level, these tools and these legal protections remain insufficient to protect indigenous peoples facing the COVID-19 crisis. Professor Olwell highlighted the vast disparities, for example, in terms of rights for Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous communities. And one of the things that was also put forward by the three speakers is the lack of respect to Indigenous people's consent and their self-governance structures. And I think this is maybe bringing me to the most important element, in my opinion, and also the most empowering one to a certain extent, is the fact that the speakers all noted the importance of respecting Indigenous people's rights and the necessity of collaborating with Indigenous peoples, both in the design and in the implementation of measures to tackle the COVID-19 crisis. And Monita Koch also discussed, for example, the actions and creative measures implemented by traditional leaders in order to spread the virus at the very local level. So just to wrap it up, it seems to me that what the discussion has shown is that it is crucial to adopt a comprehensive approach of Indigenous people's rights. It's not only about their right to health or their right to access water, it's also about their right to preserve their traditional livelihoods, languages, culture. It's about the recognition of land rights. It's about their right to sovereignty. And I think the speakers have, in that sense, highlighted the timely need to build collaborative solutions and recovery plans with the inclusion and the consent of Indigenous people, as well as plans which respect their autonomy. And I think, just to finish and to conclude, it's very meaningful to turn the spotlight on the strength and the resilience of Indigenous peoples in facing COVID-19. And I would like to just quote the very meaningful and powerful words of Monica Koch when she said, Indigenous peoples will not only survive, but they will thrive. They will find meaningful ways to go through this pandemic. And thank you again for all your words. And I think the students might have some question to ask you, and thank you again for everything.
Thank you, Laura, for those wonderful remarks. And thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to have this event. And I also want to thank all of our speakers today. We have learned a lot from you. We respect you. You have our solidarity. And I'm very happy that you were able to share your knowledge and wisdom with us today. So I have some questions in the chat, and I have one from Professor Sean Murphy, who's one of our leading professors on international law. It's wonderful that he's here with us today. Thank you, Professor Murphy. And I read the question from the chat. The vaccines being developed for COVID-19 may require that the dosage be frozen or at least refrigerated prior to being given to the individual. Are many Indigenous people especially vulnerable in this regard, given that they may be located in remote areas? If so, is the WHO, the World Health Organization, other international organizations, governments, or NGOs working to develop the necessary means for overcoming the difficulty? Any of our speakers want to try to address that question?
Yes, may I?
Good. Somebody else.
May I?
Yes, please. Yes.
Sorry, there's a problem now with connection. What a wonderful question. This is a very kind of practical and important question. I don't specifically know how this can be done. I do know that the WHO has been very active from very early on to point towards strategies to help Indigenous peoples, and I came across some suggestions they have made in order to take into account indigenous groups. But I think that this would be part of the the state's obligations, states have the obligation under, not just for indigenous peoples, but on health. So this is a very, very clear duty that they have under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And if you remember, Article 2.3 of the paragraph 3 of the International Covenant specifically says that it doesn't matter whether the state is poor or rich, they have to somehow take some measures, gradually maybe, but take some measures to ensure that these rights are realized. So this is up to the state, and we have to remember that the state is the primary the primary carer of indigenous rights and human rights. But I think that in general, without knowing a lot about WHO, I think that in general, international organizations are very eager to help, not with resources like financial resources, but with expertise and technical expertise in order to ensure that these issues are covered. But I take the point that sometimes, there are limitations, but for these limitations, states have to make priorities, and ensuring that vulnerable groups are treated is a priority. And I think that we all agree that indigenous groups are within these vulnerable groups. Thank you.
Monica or Marjolaine, do you want to add anything to the response?
Rosa, can you hear me?
Yes.
One of the things that I've noticed, at least on the ground in rural Toledo and southern Belize, in relation to vaccines, they would have, the Ministry of Health would have what we call clinics, clinic days in these individual communities, and the way that they've transported vaccines to children, for instance, is by use of a specialized, what you call those things, cooler, if you will. And so they would take these vaccines in those coolers to these communities. Now, in Belize is a little bit different in that we're a very small population nationally, but as well as land mass. So in comparison to, say, areas like the Amazon, it's so much easier to transport these things because it doesn't take too much time. So that coolers might be sufficient for keeping these vaccines at the required temperature. However, in bigger communities, like say in the Amazon region, that might be a challenge. But I've noticed one of the things that some communities have done here in terms of their little clinics that they have in the communities is the use of solar panels, where areas where they don't have electricity per se, but you've had NGOs that have donated solar panels specifically, say, for the health center or for schools. And so in those areas, you would then have the ability to keep these vaccines refrigerated. But then that's also, incumbent on the government to provide those sorts of resources to communities that don't have them, because it's not all communities that have them, it's only some communities, and it's mostly the communities that are closer to the urban areas. So the more remote communities might not have access to those sorts of, to those sorts of services. So I believe that what sometimes happens is that they're required to come into the nearest towns or urban areas to come and get these vaccines. But then again, transportation is an issue. And so, but I think there are creative ways in terms of getting around those, use of coolers or solar panels for that. There are some communities that also have generators. Again, that's where the governments can come in to provide those resources. And like, a lot of times our governments say, well, we don't have the money, we don't have the ability to do that. Yeah, but regardless of that, I believe that they have the obligation to do that, particularly when it concerns a health crisis, such as the one that we're facing.
Thank you, Monica. Did you want to add anything, Marjolaine?
I think those were really complete and excellent answers. I mean, the only thing I could slightly add would be there's also really an importance of, once we do develop a vaccine, to make sure that, once again, Indigenous communities are involved in the planning and the dissemination of information with regards to what people will be injected with, at what time, and if they agree, and how to sort of manage to obtain their consent in a respectful way. I think that'll be also particularly important right now, and maybe the help of NGOs can be particularly useful at that time to build a trusting relationship, and not just arrive and start telling people that there's a mandatory vaccine and they're going to give it to anyone. Just, once again, that sort of spirit of respecting the autonomy of the community and whatnot. But quite frankly, I think everything has been said. I should leave it more room for another question.
I have a question for Monica in the chat. And this is actually from an alum of Indiana University Law School. The question is, have you noticed, particularly among Indigenous artisans based around popular tourist areas, COVID travel bans significantly impacting their income and ability to sell their objects to tourists? That's the question.
Yes, I think am I muted?
No, we can hear you. We can hear you. Oh, now you're muted.
Sorry. Challenges with technology.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that question. Alondra, I believe it is. And yay, another alum from IUPUI. It's great to meet you. Yes, absolutely. In fact, that was one of the areas that I failed to mention earlier. Is Belize is heavily dependent on the tourism industry, and a lot of our young people and our Maya women actually are also dependent on it for income. And you will find that in heavily populated tourist areas, they will normally sell their arts and crafts. But with the travel bans that Belize has in place, and it has really impacted tourism in Belize, and so which has had a severe impact on people who depend on that. Women in particular who say, they sell their crafts and aren't able to do that anymore. And so that's been, what we find is more young people coming back to their communities without any sort of income, but it's a little bit too late to say they came back, but they don't have their milpa plots ready, for planting. So it has created some strain on these families who depend on that sort of income. Fortunately, when they come back home, they come back to families that are able to share, their food, their homes with them. But yes, this has been not only for Maya women or Indigenous youths, but also for all of Belize. Really, the tourism industry, I'd say it's a crash, has really impacted our ability to provide, some sort of income for our families. Particularly people who that's all they do. In fact, one of the issues that we've had in our communities are people coming back from these tourist areas, coming back into the communities. Like I was telling about the checkpoint, one of the leadership required mandatory quarantine for some of these people coming back, because some were coming back from areas that had positive cases for COVID. In fact, once, unfortunately, in one community that I'm intimately familiar with, they had relaxed the checkpoints and the sorts of bans. And so what happened was an individual who traveled from a tourist area came back to the community, and that's how we now have a positive case. So it's challenging all the way around, but I believe that they're working in relation to having that person isolate themselves to avoid the continued spread. But absolutely, yeah, our tourism industry is no longer what it was, and I think that it will take a lot of time for it to get back to what it was. And in fact, I think that too much Belize is focused too much on tourism, which is a very fickle industry, and not enough on agriculture, where, you know, and self-sufficiency. In fact, farmers were asking for assistance. To my knowledge, I don't know if they've received that assistance in light of the recent Hurricane Nana. Some farmers lost their crops. So yes, absolutely. It has a negative impact on us.
Thank you, Monica. I wanted to add another comment and question that I see in the chat from Professor Murphy. He's talking about how it may be of interest to all of us that the International Law Commission may embark on writing a pandemic-related treaty for potential adoption by the United Nations General Assembly. If it does, then, in his view, the needs of Indigenous peoples and other vulnerable groups should be specifically addressed in such an instrument. Do all the panelists believe this would be important and necessary? And Professor Murphy, I think, is still connected here, so you can add as well, Professor Murphy, if you want.
No, you asked the question the way I asked it, Rosa, so that's fine. And I'm just curious if folks think this is a good idea and if they have any thoughts for what should be in a treaty that would be helpful to Indigenous peoples in that regard.
Absolutely, Professor Murphy. I agree with you. I think that who best but the Indigenous peoples themselves would know what their needs are and how they ought to respond to pandemics such as the one that we're currently facing, given the unique situation that we find ourselves in. As I say we, because as an Indigenous person, for instance, our communal ways of living, everything we do is, you know, even just we're very dependent on each other. For instance, even just the barter system with labor exchange, planting season, you know, we exchange labor where if your crop needs to be planted today, I'm gonna go help you, and then tomorrow, you know, you come and help me, those sorts of things. That these are unique situations that national governments might not take into consideration when they are creating laws dealing with health, you know, pandemics of this sort. And so I feel that it is extremely important that we talk to the people on the ground, particularly our traditional leaders, in terms of creating meaningful ways of dealing with these issues. Because a lot of times when our input, our views aren't taken into consideration, the laws that are generated don't work for us. And so what I see, for instance, is the criminalization of Indigenous peoples for not following national laws that are being generated because there might be a disconnect of some sort, a lack of either understanding or even knowledge of that law. And so I think absolutely, I think that IPs should definitely, you know, have a voice and they should be asked their opinion. The only issue I see with that, say governments, say like Belize, for instance, is while we may have these treaties and they might, you know, take into consideration the views of Indigenous peoples, is when we begin to talk about the domestic areas of law within these individual countries, is the respect for those types of treaties. You know, a lot of times, like for instance, we recently had an equal opportunities bill that that the Senate was going to debate on recently in Belize. But, you know, the conservative churches, the evangelicals, decided that because some of it had to do with with the LGBTQ issues, they were like, no, we're going to kill this bill. But in that bill itself, it created a space for protection against discrimination, and it would include, Indigenous peoples as well. And so the issue is getting the government to actually respect or to develop domestic laws that would respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. And that is a struggle that we have, that we have in Belize. For instance, we were affirmed our land rights by the highest courts in Belize, the Caribbean Court of Justice. And even now, the implementation of that very, very awesome order has been a struggle because of the I guess I don't know how to. The government has done a lot, and I applaud them for that, but at a snail's pace. And I think part of it is the lack of political will. And that, again, laws are great, are only, the way I look at it, are only great if they're actually followed and respected. And so these are just some of the challenges, and I don't want to put a negative spin on it, but it's some of the challenges that we face down here in Southern Belize and that are very real. And so I think that if you have governments that are willing, that have the political will to do right by Indigenous peoples, I think it can work. But again, it needs to be a collaborative effort, and a meaningful and a true one at that, not just because I want to look good on the international scene, but it has to be, your heart has to be for the people. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on that.
I'm sorry, I think Professor Santaki, Alessandra, you have something to add? Did you say?
Yes.
Please.
Yes, I said that I agreed with Professor Murphy, but now I disagree. Changed my mind. I think that it would, the experience of the 25 years of kind of creating the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the recent migration crisis has shown that at the moment human rights, and maybe some governments around the world, I'm trying to think which ones, but anyway, who have been very clearly against international human rights law, have shown us that this is not the right moment to start talking about a binding human rights instrument, because a binding human rights instrument is going to lower the standards, and we don't want that. You can see that with migration, we already have the binding instrument, and it's not being respected. So just to spend all our efforts, I can tell you from even before this discussion starts, that, when all governments meet up, and when somebody says, let's talk about Indigenous peoples and what the state's obligation should be when it comes to COVID, Philippines or US will put their hands up and would say, yes, but let's talk who Indigenous peoples are. So we're going to spend the whole kind of, time on talking about who Indigenous peoples are. And then we're going to spend the whole next kind of, session talking about why Indigenous people should have different rights, and vulnerable sections should have different rights from the rest of the population. So I think this is going to be a waste of energy and time, whereas sometimes soft law works better. And sometimes we lawyers have to accept that non-law works better than law. So, going to, and specifically with anthropologists and with political scientists and lobby governments and try to take specific measures may work better. So in principle, and as an international lawyer, my original reaction was, yeah, let's do that. But I think that thinking about the current reality, another treaty, another discussion for a treaty is just going to delay us, and is going to take away the focus and the energy from taking specific measures that are going to be helpful.
Thank you, Alessandra. Marjolaine, do you want to have the closing words, because we're almost at the end of our event?
I'm happy you changed your position, Professor Santaki. I was like, I agree, but then I have a lot of, my reticence is also timing. I'm hoping that we're actually capable of taking measures with regards to the pandemic, or I should say, I'm hoping that this pandemic might not last for 10 to 15 to 20 to 25 years, which might be the time it will take to negotiate a binding instrument, right? So I think at this time, it's not that I don't think it's relevant. I think we want maybe eventually a document or a binding instrument with regards to health that includes Indigenous perspectives, that includes their participation. But I think in order to be capable of actually getting that, the pandemic will be long gone. And as Professor Shantaki, Alexandra was mentioning, we'll have wasted large amounts of money and of energy into a process that won't have immediate effects in a crisis that requires immediate attention. I'd also maybe point out, and going back to what I said, is a lot of the issues that have been brought up today are issues that are actually underlying and structural and have, been exacerbated by COVID, but were not created by COVID. And only attempting to address the issues specifically related to the pandemic might actually just really invisibilize the reasons why Indigenous communities are currently being affected so disproportionately by the pandemic with regards to non-Indigenous communities. And so the idea is not to reject the idea of a pandemic, but if we're talking about of a binding treaty with regards to the pandemic and human rights, but rather to talk about maybe soft law or maybe non-legal measures right now, I think that was an excellent point, are what we have to be looking at in order to truly push forward better rights for Indigenous peoples at large. So those are my closing words. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here and listening in, and for the invitation.
Thank you, Marjolaine. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Laura. And thank you to all of you that have joined us today for this wonderful discussion. Please take care. And I hope we see each other soon, and hopefully in person at some point. Take care. Thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.